talk about is just some general high-level techniques that the modern cyber criminal is using for covert communications. Okay. If we can get these slides to advance, it'd be a great thing. Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about hidden communications. The great poets of New York City, the Beastie Boys, they once had a song, started off, "Let it flow, let yourself go, slow and low, that is the tempo." And that is basically how these cyber criminals are using their hidden communications, right? So when you're looking at command and control, and you're looking at the type of behavior that these folks are exhibiting, ultimately they don't want to get caught, right? I mean, they are going to move at a pace that evades detection and so forth, and there are many ways to hide. The one thing to remember throughout this presentation is that the attacker owns typically both ends of the session, right? So we'll just keep that in mind. We're going to revisit that theme a number of times, but the biggest thing, right, is really the two areas that we're looking at for hidden communications are command and control and data exfiltration. And when you look at the types of protocols and applications, even protocols like ICMP can be used to tunnel. The other piece, too, is we talk about kind of the themes in this presentation is the concepts and tenets around the cyber attack kill chain. And most of you are familiar with these techniques, but again, when we look at hidden communications, there are a few areas that stick out. Typically, my employer and the products that we make and sell to our customers, we divide the types of CNC into really two places. One is your commodity botnet, Bitcoin mining, and so forth, but more or less the bottom tier with those targeted attacks are those ones constructed specifically for a high-impact organization, maybe where the attack will occur over several weeks or months. And throughout those points, right, I mean, the points of interest, right, are the areas that could be hidden, the command and control, the exfiltration. And so when we look at the types of behaviors, and I'm going to use that word quite a bit, we have to be mindful of, number one, where to look, how to look, and how we should be approaching this problem a little bit differently. So let's just talk really quickly about CNC servers. Just like, and you guys have probably heard the term indicators of compromise a few times over the last couple days. The attacking entities behave the same way, right? They look for indicators of detection. And what they'll do is they'll look at techniques to give validation that that I know that I attacked you. And when that does occur, they'll get into these, the domain generation algorithm rotation business, and they'll start popping around and changing their location or changing where the CNC traffic originates to and from. There's going to be tools like, commodity tools like Gmail, Dropbox, and others that are being used for CNC. We're going to talk about that. Simply put, though, the reuse of command and control, that can lead to getting caught from these individuals. If they start using and continuously use the same locations, that could lead to their attack not being successful. So what we're going to talk about is behavior quite a bit today. I mentioned that before. There's some fundamental tenets around behavior that's interesting. There are elements of any type of packet or attack that can continuously change. IP addresses, URLs, hashes, domains, so on and so forth. Underlying throughout all of those elements is consistent behavior from one attack to the next, or a group or a family of attacks. They're going to exhibit the same exact behavior. The other piece, too, that I think is very important is just having the source of truth. And the way we do business at Vectra is we're in the business of collecting packets and looking at them as the source of truth. We're not using summary information or log generation, but we're actually looking at packets, both encrypted and unencrypted. And that provides very valuable information around covert communications. And then we expect the attackers to play games of hide and seek, right? They're going to bury themselves within DNS, for example, or ICMP or HTTP. So we're going to see these types of behaviors exhibited, and really there's a few components in looking at this problem, right? There's how do we approach this? So the words machine learning and data science, I'm sure that those are terms that have been overheard or discussed over the past couple of days. They're not buzzwords, they're actually real. And so there's a couple elements and approaches to doing this type of activity. When you look at supervised learning, and the way Vectra does it is we take massive samples of malware and malicious traffic, and we profile and build statistical mathematical models based on what are the common attributes of a command and control session, because they're different than normal user traffic. What are the flow types? What's the pace? What's the cadence within that particular session? And inherently what that allows us to do is to get out of the business of this extended learning process. There's no local learning for supervised algorithms to work. They can detect things very instantly. The unsupervised learning piece is based on behavior. So, for example, there's a few attributes common to human beings. One is, time and frequency and patterns and, the types of systems that you go to on a day-to-day basis, the types of credentials you use for Kerberos. And so once that pattern establishes and there's a profile built on who you are, it's very mathematically, certain to predict and determine deviations from that pattern. If there's a set of credentials that originate from your host that you've never used before to a system that you've never talked to before, for example. So data science, right? I mean, this is an approach to looking at these patterns, getting out of the business of signatures. So let's talk a little bit about hiding within encryption. So more and more traffic today is encrypted, right? I mean, if you have a cloud service, most of the time by default that's going to be encrypted outbound. But I guess by a show of hands, who's concerned about malware or any type of malicious traffic just being encrypted on the outbound? I would expect that most of you are. And it's a difficult problem to solve. There's one, aspect, right? I mean, I talk to a lot of folks and customers that are considering packet inspection and data collection strategies where basically they decrypt everything. But that's effectively a massive shift, and you have to start getting in the business of managing certs. If there's anybody from Venafi in the room, they were downstairs well represented. But that's effectively that one technique in approaching for that problem. Again, I mentioned before, when you're looking at SSL, you're looking at both ends of the session. Now, the other aspect too is, it's just going to continue to there's going to continue to be more and more encryption. And it's going to become more and more difficult, I guess, if you're looking at deep packet inspection types of technologies to address problems if you're looking at payloads for, known behaviors and so forth. So let's just do a quick poll. Do you decrypt your network traffic for security inspection today? For any of those who decrypt everything, can I get a show of hands? 1? Okay. Some traffic is selectively decrypted by policy. Less than 10. No traffic is decrypted. I don't today, but I'm planning in the future. Okay, so that suggests really where we're all at from a baseline perspective. Most of us are facing the problem of, encrypted tunnels and being unable to possibly look into the payloads or look into the traditional areas that one would look to identify malicious behavior. So how do we solve this problem? So the use of Sherlock Holmes, fictitious detective, is a little, interesting, I guess, for this analogy. But the quote is, I think, applies. When you're looking at the individual, the puzzle is somewhat insoluble. But when you look at the group, there are mathematical and statistical certainties, right? So what do I mean by that? We don't have to look at an individual ant and fingerprint it to know exactly what the behavior is. But if we look at the flow, we can see a pattern, for example. And within data science and machine learning techniques, this is true as well. So what do we look at, and what are the models built around to reveal underlying behavior? So the one is communication cadence. Who's in control of the session? The second is who's in control of the session, and then does the session look to be automated, or is it a human-driven session? So, for example, if I'm using a browser and I'm initiating the outbound, it's going to originate from in to out versus outside to in. If it's out to in, then you know that there's some entity on the outside dictating commands and controlling the flow of a particular session. These are all elements available within the header of a packet, whether it's encrypted or not. So when we look at the distinctive patterns of malicious traffic, right? I mean, again, we can look at the flows and the sequences. That's one element of it. And so what details are available? So we can, that's how we build models around, our command and control detections within our product and using the use of data science. So again, when you're looking at the patterns, I mean, you're looking for potential command and control instructions. What remote access tools are available that are originating from the outside, or what's the cadence that is originating from the inside? Malware updates, and so on and so forth. So again, these are all very tangible and mathematical types of details that we can create algorithms against. So when you look at, I guess, Warden Norton, and he's inspecting the tunnel that Andy Dufresne used to get out of Shawshank. We also recognize the fact that these are present in modern networks today. And they're techniques that are used by attackers to basically hide and obfuscate their, the types of activity that they're doing. So what do we see this in? We see it in HTTP. We see it in SSL. We see it in DNS. It's available in ICMP. There's a ton of different ways to hide and create tunnels within normal protocols, for example. It becomes very difficult to create signatures and continuously match patterns when, one, they're changing on a day-to-day basis, and secondly, you may have liberal outbound policies that permit these protocols. They're business legitimate, I guess, is for lack of better terms, and it's very difficult to take a legitimate protocol, constantly inspect it, and especially if you have hidden messages in optional fields, for example, or fragmented packets that have messages strewn throughout, different packets within that flow that occur over a long period of time. So it's, once again, the signature or the creation of a pattern matching becomes very difficult in this scenario. Like when you're looking at HTTP or HTTPS, Meterpreter is a good example used over SSL. Very difficult to potentially detect with common signature-based tools, but again, we're considered and we're concerned with the behavior of these types of tunnels, specifically within the header. We're looking at the patterns once again. So what we found within our study, and we collect metadata from customers that choose to opt in, we're seeing this uptick on, hidden tunnels and more importantly, the use of SSL. So year over year, we've seen this progression, the use of HTTPS. But as you can see, we have both command and control and data exfiltration represented by the types of tunnels that our customers have experienced within their own environments. DNS, interestingly enough, is using, or exfiltration is using DNS tunnels to tunnel data out of the environment. So let's talk a little bit about hiding within allowed applications. Anybody watch Walking Dead in this room? Handful. Okay, so everybody knows, or those who watch, there's a technique that that the survivors use to blend in with the zombies and not get bitten or whatever, and they just effectively cut open a zombie and rub blood and guts on themselves, and they're allowed to basically roam freely with the dead undetected. And if you're hiding within allowed applications, like this example, there's a scenario. Did anybody read about this? The use of Gmail and the drafts folder to act as a command and control, session, and effectively using a hidden browser, using the drafts folder within Gmail to issue command and control commands down to the infected client. What's interesting about this, right, is most organizations are going to consider Gmail a legitimate application. They're going to consider Dropbox consider a legitimate application, and so on and so forth. But again, it's something that it's very difficult and impossible to construct signatures that can be repeated over time to provide visibility into what's actually happening. So rather than using the animal classification scheme, King Philip came over for grape soda or whatever it was that we all learned back in the day. Instead of trying to name every species on the planet, and by the way, there were 200 new species learned in Asia just last year. It's an uphill battle, right? There's a million, I guess is the latest data point on how many new variants of malware come out per day. It's impossible to do. So rather than name everything, we're going to focus again on behavior and looking at patterns and understanding, because it's Gmail, I can't necessarily write a signature around it, but I can look at the behavior and understand that within this permitted business application, I have a command and control session running. So again, let's not call it what it does or what it looks like, Gmail. Let's focus on what it's actually doing from a behavioral perspective. Again, just a couple more points on this. There was never an email message sent within this session. It's just commands from the draft folder down to the infected host. So again, this is something mathematically we can easily detect and demonstrate. So what does that look like, right? There's within a command and control, on the wire you're going to see sets of instructions, right? There's going to be there's, and directionality is a big deal when you're looking at this type of behavior, especially if it's encrypted. So who's initiating the session? And in this case, on a polling scenario, you have a client that's initiating queries basically to the outbound CNC server, asking what's the next step, what do I do next? And effectively, that's what happened with this Gmail instance. Poll question. So within this room, I guess what do you think poses the greatest risk? Is it cloud-based applications with Facebook, Gmail, Dropbox, and others? Anybody agree with A in this room? B would be cloud-based applications, file share, CRM tools. C, on-prem applications, and D, IT and admin tools. The short answer, I guess, when I've had this conversation before, a lot of folks are concerned about A, and they're concerned about, there was a Taiwanese time bomb event that occurred using Dropbox. So these legitimate tools that we all use in, our business environments being permitted as if they're as advertised, but underneath, under the covers, within the packet where the truth lies, there's malicious activity and behavior occurring. So let's talk a little bit about remote access. And if there's any Game of Thrones fans in this room, we all know that Bran has this innate ability to control his dire wolf and instruct him to rip the throats out of any threat potentially to him or others. But when you're looking at remote access, right, I mean, there's really a few components. And at some point within a kill chain-based attack, there becomes a shift from automation to human control. At some point, there's going to be a set of fingertips on a keyboard in some nation, state environment that's going to take over and control. And generally, the presence of a remote access toolkit suggests that, the next phase or advancement in that attack is going to occur. So what are the constructs around that, right? I mean, there's definitely some things that require consideration. I mean, there's a lot of tools used within, normal business that look and feel like remote access tools, WebEx, GoToMeeting, so on and so forth. There's a lot of remote control tools out there. But again, we have to understand, too, when does the shift happen? Is there a presence of an existing command and control session, existing behavior within that host, and then subsequently a shift over to something that looks and feels like a rat, for example? So when we look at the connection side of things, there might be an origination point from the inside to go back out. That might be the automation piece to start the process. The remote access is now in place, and now we have to understand what's the pattern like from the remote attacker to the inside user. Are there breaks within the communication, and where do those breaks initiate to and from? RSA did a recent discovery. This was early, I guess, fall of 2015, of a rat called GlassRAT, and it went undetected for a 3-year period. And what they ended up doing is they were using a valid cert from a software company in China, and basically when RSA tested this, it failed 57 individual antivirus providers in terms of detection. So, again, these are types of things that can evade known technologies, and they're going to they're going to fall below the radar. What they ended up doing, though, is they were able to identify a dropper, which, at that time there were no signatures present for that dropper, and they were able to identify and then start backing into where this attack originated from. But again, it's when we looked at it, right, it did show up as a remote access tunnel. Once it was remote access tool. Once this once this became widely available, RSA published their paper on this. We took a look at it within our labs, and again, it's back to behavior. It behaved very similar to Netcat in this case. So lastly, let's talk a little bit about anonymization, and again, just obscuring identity. Hiding where we're originating or what our original source is. And so really the two techniques that we're going to talk about are TOR and peer-to-peer. And I think most of you are familiar with the onion router, and effectively this is a common technique, both inside and outside, to obscure your point of origin, and basically you're hopping and routing at different points until you hit your desired egress node, and at that point your native source is effectively hidden, and it's also encrypted by default. But with TOR, it's very recognizable within a pattern and mathematical sequence. The other one too is around peer-to-peer, and when you look at peer-to-peer, pretty resilient, right? If a node fails, then they can bounce to the next one and reestablish a command and control presence. So it's jumping around, and again, this is something too, and as the bullet point suggests, it's very resistant to takedown attempts for the command and control, simply because it can rotate and shift around. But again, these types of techniques, the whole theme of this, right, is very easy to detect from a statistical and mathematical model using data science. The other element to be aware of too is when we're looking at traffic within an internal environment, right? So I've been talking about TOR, I've been talking about peer-to-peer, and those are going to go inside to out or outside to in. But there's another technique used to stage traffic potentially for exfiltration. And in some cases, right, this might not even be a human-operated device. It could be just an IoT device. There could be proxy set up somewhere. But again, this is a behavior and a technique used to potentially exfiltrate data out of the environment. One of the things that we proved within our own labs, and this isn't necessarily rocket science, right? It was mainly an objective to, I guess, prove the point, is within our own labs we showed the ability to break into a camera and basically install a remote access kit into that camera. And there's well-documented use cases out there with medical devices, infusion pumps, and the fact that a lot of vendors or even consumers of these devices, they'll leave static passwords in there, the default passwords, simply because if you have a service technician, maybe they're the ones that know that, but it's certainly the next point where we're going to have some concern, because again, these are non-human operated devices. There's a degree of automation built in, and then when they do become exploited and used in a way to help obfuscate, outbound communications, it's going to create a lot more pressure on us. So the biggest thing, though, is again just the behavioral element. So just to summarize on what we've talked about, right? In hidden communications are definitely persistent in most attacks, and again, the thing to remember is looking at the control side of things, right? So where's the session being controlled from? Is it remotely or is it locally? These are very easy things to pick up with in the actual packet headers in spite of encryption. I would say this, right? Signatures are unsuited for trying to solve problems, especially as the number of new variants is just growing by the day. And when we're looking at behavior and we look at the example of Dropbox or Gmail, we can't necessarily write a signature for that. Your policy suggests that those are going to be allowed applications within your environment. And if it looks like Gmail, but it is doing something else, then we have to look at the behavior. And so finally, too, the actions, right? I mean, again, those are going to be present as well, and the supervised and unsupervised learning data science approach will allow us to, produce valid detections around these new creative ways that attackers are using. So with that, I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes back. I appreciate your time. Any questions at this point? Yes, sir. So the question was, have I seen any covert communications with games with TCP sequencing numbers and so forth? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I haven't seen it personally with my product, right, with any of the customers that I'm working with. But, I mean, I do know that, manipulation of the sequence numbers is, it's been tried and true for quite some time. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.